that this bill is not just a critically important bill, but it is a time-sensitive, critically important bill. It is something on which the opportunity to move is now. We must move now, otherwise we may be at a disadvantage. We already are behind a number of other states, like Massachusetts, like Rhode Island, like North Carolina in certain respects, that have moved to improve their regulatory systems in the wake of the changing healthcare world in the last several years. We cannot afford to be presented with a fait accompli as things change around us without adapting our regulatory climate. And that is what this bill will do. Again, the process began last year. In the spring of last year, Senator Fasano and I began to work together on what was then Senate Bill 35 of the 2014 session, Public Act 14-168, that dealt with some of the issues that were starting to emerge at that time and our concern about hospital conversions, about acquisition of physicians' practices, and other things that were happening at a rapid pace, and at a pace that we believed, without some further regulation, was going to create a vacuum that was going to be damaging to public health policy in the state. So we passed that bill last year and acknowledged at the time that it was, in effect, a beginning of the process. It was a marker and a beginning of the process, and what we are now presenting tonight is a further manifestation and a further development in that process. And it is one that has occurred in a very painstaking way. We convened the Bipartisan Roundtable on Hospitals and Healthcare beginning last fall and had a number of meetings.
If you look in New Haven County, there are no private oncologists. Not one. Not one private oncologist. I think there's one urologist, and that's a part-timer and an older doctor. There are a handful of cardiologists, and the list goes on. And they're all being owned by one health system. And someone may argue, well, what's so wrong with that? Why isn't that free marketplace? Because it's not a free marketplace. And it is driving up costs considerably. When a chemotherapy shot that you get, a routine shot, is $2,500, and a few years later it is $12,500, there's a concern. When chemotherapy, that's a cornered market in our area, ends up with rates that go up 200+%, that's a concern for all of us. So what's happening? What's happening is the smaller practices are being bought out, and you'll hear some of the, and at least in my neck of the woods, arguing we don't buy them out, they come to us. But that isn't the testimony we receive. That isn't the phone calls we receive. It's not the letters we receive. We receive that they're reaching out. Why? Because it makes sense. And all you have to do is look at the numbers. I'm not against free marketplace. People know that. They've heard me talk in this circle. But when we regulate on one end, to the point that we create a monopoly that raises cost on healthcare, there are core functions of government. Healthcare is a core function of government.
When you're ill, when your son or daughter falls out of a tree and breaks a limb, when your mom or dad are facing difficult medical decisions that may require long-term care, when you wake up and all of a sudden something is happening to you that you realize I've got to go get a doctor's advice as to how I'm going to deal with high blood pressure, cholesterol, or whatever, you can't just say, I'm not going to do that. Or you do it at your huge peril. And so not only do we have a higher duty, in my view, because we're dealing with life and death decisions that people can't walk away from, but I would also add on top of that is that taxpayer dollars, either federal or state, and in some respects, municipal to some degree, enter into the system. And when we're dealing with these critical decisions that people can't walk away from, and a huge funding component are tax dollars, then our duty is heightened to intervene. It can't be the wild, wild west. And I hear that, and I believe in free markets, but in some instances, free markets don't work. In some instances, advocates are advocating for free markets so big fish can gobble up little fish.
The legislation that we have before us is also a compilation of pieces of legislation. I think I had 8 or 9 bills in the Public Health Committee alone on these very subjects. And I must say, they are all constituent-driven, all consumer-driven. This is legislation that takes into account what our consumers and what our constituents, and indeed we are all consumers here in this circle, and what our constituents are experiencing out there in the healthcare climate that we have now.
And we have a right to weigh in on that decision. We have a right to say, okay, enough is enough. We've sort of let these free market forces prevail, but if we continue along this path, the ultimate net result for the state of Connecticut will be less healthcare options, less ability to keep our state's people healthy and happy and moving forward.